Guilt is one of my least favorite emotions. It lives in my upper back, under my shoulder blades, and in my face and neck, just behind my jaw. It draws me in on myself, making me not only metaphorically defensive, but literally putting me in a defensive, hunkered down kind of stance. I'm not open, curious, courageous, the way that I want to be. In fact, I'm starting to feel guilty for preaching with a mask on. Because I know that I am less accessible, harder to understand when I'm wearing a mask. As someone with partial deafness, I have a hard time understanding people when I can't see their facial expressions. As Audre Lorde reminded us this morning, guilt is not a response to anger. It is a response to one's own actions or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it is then no longer guilt, but the beginning of knowledge. May my guilt lead me to change. So, the part that I said with the mask on, I'll summarize as guilt being one of my least favorite emotions. It lives in my body. It prohibits me from being as courageous as I would like, and I'm not a big fan of guilt. In the Spider-Man origin story, our hero must constantly deal with his guilt of knowing that he could have prevented the death of his Uncle Ben, a man who raised and taught him how to be a caring and compassionate person. Spider-Man had the chance to stop the thief who murdered Uncle Ben, but he decided to get even with a crooked wrestling promoter by letting the thief go. His pettiness led to the death of an innocent person who was like a father to Spider-Man. One can hardly imagine the level of guilt that must instill in a person, much less a teenager with little experience of processing deep emotional hurt and turmoil. When he chases down the thief who killed Uncle Ben, the criminal begs Spider-Man, saying, "Just give me a chance." Spider-Man replies, "What about my Uncle Ben? Did you give him a chance?" Then he commits savage and unnecessary acts of physical violence against the criminal because, and I say this with all the ambiguity and guilt of someone whose favorite movie so far this year is John Wick 2, there's nothing movie audiences love more than righteous violence. Fueled by the guilt of his complicity in Uncle Ben's death, Spider-Man becomes one of the most prolific crime fighters in New York City. He's taken Audre Lorde's words to heart. Guilt is a response to one's own lack of action. If it leads to change, it can be useful. The guilt leads him to change, and he is thereby making it useful. The hard thing about guilt is that especially these days, it can feel like it's always there, one way or another. We are so cognizant of the need for self-care that when we overwork or overextend ourselves, we feel bad for not paying attention to our own needs more. But on the other hand, there's so much more to do than any one person possibly can do, that when we take time to care for ourselves, it's easy to feel guilty about the work we are not doing. That work might be a job or a volunteer commitment, an educational goal, a family, social, or caretaking commitment, almost any obligation, whether self-imposed or externally imposed. I can't even keep track of all the things in my life that I feel guilty about not paying attention to, but I knew that the list had gotten too long when I started catching myself feeling bad about not paying enough attention to my fantasy football team. What I ended up doing in fantasy football is that I became co-owners of a team with my friend Andy, who I grew up going to church with and playing with while our moms went to women's group together. Shout out to small group ministry, anyone who is in a small group ministry group, and anyone who gets to play with your friends while your parents are in a small group ministry group. So Andy and I co-own a fantasy football and a fantasy basketball team now, and if one of us forgets to set a lineup or put in a waiver claim, the other one usually has their back. More importantly, it's been a helpful way to stay in touch with a valued and longtime friend. I am grateful once again for Audre Lorde's instruction that guilt can be useful if it leads to change. We saw a little bit of this in Spider-Man 2 this morning, where Peter's guilt has led him to change how he is present and caring for the love of his life, Mary Jane. He tells her, I shined my shoes, combed my hair, did my homework. I do my homework now. After failing to be there for her earlier in the movie, failing to be there both for her and for his duties fighting crime, Peter wants her to know that he's there for her now. He felt guilty and probably sad and lonely and some other emotions about sacrificing the intimate love that he and Mary Jane have for each other, and so he's doing his best now to change. But his changing is not enough, since she tells him, Peter, I'm getting married. I was surprised by how not devastated he seemed, and indeed, by the end of the movie, spoiler alert, Mary Jane is rushing back to be with Peter. I guess that's superhero privilege. I admit that part of the reason that this movie resonates with me is that I was 17 when Spider-Man 2 came out, and I definitely would have sacrificed superhuman powers to get to go out with Kirsten Dunst. She's the actress who plays Mary Jane, and I suspect there are some of us here who would be highly flattered for Tobey Maguire, the guy who plays Peter Parker, to shine his shoes, comb his hair, and start doing his homework on our behalf. They are a stunningly glamorous couple, even accounting for the degree to which we've been socialized to prefer the traits of thin, white, hetero, cisgendered actors and actresses. But even if neither of these folks make you want to hang upside down from a fire escape and give them a kiss, there are relatable aspects to Peter Parker's life and Spider-Man's work and how those interfere with each other. Aunt May has also helped to raise Peter and is the most important person in the world to him after Uncle Ben dies. But in Spider-Man 2, we find out that Aunt May is facing financial troubles and eviction. Even in the midst of all that, she is giving Peter money, seeing that he's spread thin and needs help. He gratefully accepts it, but then he finds out that she is facing eviction, and he feels guilty for accepting help from her and not being able to do more, at least to that point, to help Aunt May avoid eviction. It seems that as much guilt as Spider-Man feels for not having been able to save Uncle Ben, there is plenty of guilt left over for Peter Parker to feel about not being able to help Aunt May in the aftermath. So there is the Spider-Man side to this equation where he will literally never be able to fight enough crime that he can stop feeling guilty about being complicit in Uncle Ben's death. And there's the Peter Parker side of this where he still has a life to live and he feels guilty about not being there for his friends and his family who need him. Right from the beginning, Peter Parker has understood Spider-Man's need to assuage his guilt by fighting crime in New York City. But it takes longer for Spider-Man to realize that Peter Parker has needs also and to ease off of his crime fighting, pick his battles, choose his responsibilities so that Peter can have a real life too. In Spider-Man 2, the stress of Peter's life falling apart actually makes Spider-Man's powers go away at various times. This is part of how Spider-Man realizes that his needs and Peter Parker's are intertwined, that together they cannot be the superhero or the regular guy that they want to be unless they can strike a balance, find a happy medium. And if we are open to it, this balance can inform our own lives also. Just as the guilt-driven need to fight crime will forever fuel Spider-Man, I have been motivated for as long as I can remember by an internal voice telling me I can never do enough to make the world a more just and equitable place, and that because I can never do enough, I have to do absolutely, literally everything I can, or else my life will have been wasted. Thanks to a lot of good advice and difficult introspection, I no longer believe that voice, but it's still there. I've started asking myself, is this guilt productive? Is there something I can actually do based on the guilt I'm feeling? What is a reasonable thing to do or amount to do based on my guilt and an objective assessment of the situation that I'm in? And then I try to do what I can do and not worry about the rest. I like to think that these days my inner Spider-Man gives sufficient room to my inner Peter Parker to live his life in a healthy and productive manner that allows me to be there for my friends and family in the ways that are important to me. My aunt hasn't gotten evicted and, in fact, lives in a really nice house these days, so that feels like a good sign. But for some people, the voice of guilt is less one of general angst than it is tied to a specific event. My wife, Annie, told me this week that her biggest professional goal is tied to an event in her personal life that caused her years' worth of horrific guilt. Annie is a physician, and her passion is palliative care and having end-of-life conversations with the families of people who are dying. She's very skilled in this field and takes every opportunity to teach about it at Emory Hospital. Until now, I had not realized how much of her passion in this area is driven by feeling like her father's death could have been handled better. He passed away in 2012, and though he was in hospice care, Annie and I saw the ways that the situation could have been handled better in terms of caring for their family and communicating with their family. Annie herself felt like she personally could have done more to prepare her parents for this situation. She felt guilty about this for a long time, but then decided that although she could never go back and change her family's experience, she could improve that experience for others in the future. She accepted that if guilt leads to change, then it can be useful. And so, whether you take your cues from Spider-Man or from Audre Lorde, whether your guilt is general or specific or all of the above and more, the blessing I leave you with today is this. May your guilt lead to change so that it can be useful. Peace, salam, shalom, and may it be so.